Matthew chapter 13, and then a few verses also from Ephesians chapter 1. So first of all, Matthew 13, and then Ephesians chapter 1. Matthew 13, and beginning at verse 44. Verse 44. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again. And then in his joy, went and sold all that he had and bought that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant who is looking for fine pearls. When he found one of great value, he went away and sold everything he had and bought it. Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 3. Praise be to the God and the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us in the heavenly realms with every spiritual blessing in Christ. For he chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight. In love, he predestined us for adoption to sonship through Jesus Christ, in accordance with his pleasure and will, to the praise of his glorious grace, which he has freely given us in the one he loves. In him we have redemption through his blood. That is, the forgiveness of our sins, in accordance with the riches of God's grace that he lavished on us with all wisdom and understanding. I don't know if you saw the headline a couple of weeks ago. Somebody bought something. Paid quite a lot too. £89 million they paid. A football club buying one player for £89 million. Now, I don't know what you think about that. I don't know whether you think it was money well spent or whether you think it's just a disgusting use of money. But let's change the question. What is the most expensive thing? I know it's not going to come anywhere near £89 million. What is the most expensive thing that you have? Or to rephrase it, what is the most precious? Now that may well not be a thing, but a person. What is the greatest treasure in your life? Because that's the question that Jesus is asking of us in these two parables here. Once again, it's like we had with the mustard seed and the yeast. It's like a pair that belong together, but they're just a little bit different. And the difference is just bring an extra dimension to what Jesus is saying to us. The one who is digging in a field and just finds treasure. The other who is looking for fine pearls and finds just one of supreme value. And both go away, sell everything else in order to have that one thing. Is there anything that we would sell everything else for? Two stories, both men find something of supreme value. The PowerPoint's not of supreme value, and we can't find it anyway. We've been looking. But at least in Jesus' parable, they find something. The first man finds buried treasure. See, in those days where there were no safety deposit companies, although after last year on the Hatton Garden break-in, what is safe? It may be better to go back to sticking it under the mattress. But in those days when there was no bank or safe place, people would bury it in the ground. If they were going to go off on a long journey and be away for a long time, rather than just leave it in a cupboard in the house, they would bury it in the ground. But if something happened on their journey, they might not come back. Alternatively, in a time of war or of trouble, people may be afraid that their possessions might be stolen by enemy soldiers, so they would take them and bury them somewhere in a field. But if they didn't survive the war, it may not be until sometime later that somebody else finds that treasure. You might be asking the question, why was the first man digging in a field anyway? I mean, maybe he was simply a farmer, a worker. And some think that to claim the treasure that he found, he needs to have ownership of the field. Others think not quite finders keepers, but a little bit more like that. You see, land was owned by paying money and having a deed that said you own it. But objects that can be lifted, there was a law that said that if you could lift it, then if you did, then it was yours. However, things were rarely quite as simple as that. If the man digging in the field was a peasant farmer, then probably he didn't own the field. His employer did. And one of the laws of the rabbis was that if a worker finds treasure, it belongs to the master. So this man needs to have ownership of the field, to take ownership of the treasure. However, we don't need to get caught up with the questions of, was he being honest? Is it quite legal? The point that Jesus is trying to make is this. There is a treasure for which it is worth giving up absolutely everything else. There is a treasure for which it is worth making any sacrifice necessary in order to have it. And in the first parable, it seems to me that Jesus is saying that sometimes we can stumble across this treasure almost unexpectedly. He didn't say he had one of these metal detectors that he was sort of hovering over the field hoping to find something. He was just digging in the field. And sometimes we can find treasure almost without looking. One late Sunday afternoon, two people were out walking. They were just talking together. But their heads were bowed because they were very sad. Somebody very close to them had recently died. And they were just trying to come to terms with it as they walked along the road together. And as they walked, they met somebody else who was also out walking, and the three of them began to walk together. And the third person asked the first two, what are you talking about? You're looking very sad. And one of the two said to him, are you the only person in this place that doesn't know what's been going on? Have you not heard what they did to Jesus of Nazareth, the prophet? The one that we thought was going to restore the nation. Now they've taken him and they've killed him. And all of our hopes are being killed too. And of course, they don't recognize at that moment. Somehow, God stops them from seeing that actually this is the risen Jesus walking with them. Jesus began to teach them from the Scriptures. The Messiah must suffer and die, and then enter into his glory. After some time, they come to a house, and the two people are going to stop and stay, and they invite Jesus to go in and to eat with them. And as they sit at table, Jesus takes bread and breaks it, and suddenly they realize who it is. Jesus takes his leave of them, and as they look at each other as they're sat at the table, it's like, wow. Didn't our hearts burn within us when he was talking to us? Helping us to understand the Scriptures? They hadn't gone out looking for something, but unexpectedly they found a great treasure. The second of these two parables is a little different, because here we have a man who is a merchant. A man who is travelling and looking for some very fine pearls. So a wholesaler, rather than somebody who owns a little shop and is selling from there. Today, in some parts of the world, you can go and visit a pearl farm. But in those days, you needed to employ a diver to dive into the Red Sea or into the Persian Gulf and to search for and to bring up pearls. Sometimes they found something a little bit special. Of course, the price was way beyond the ordinary person like you and I. This man knew what he was looking for. He knew what he wanted. And he knew when he found it. Good pearl, special pearl, will depend on how round it is. You know, if it's a little bit out of shape, then it's not going to fetch the same price as a pearl that is really round. And then it will depend on how bright it is. If it's a bit sort of dull and chalky, then it's not going to be as valuable as a bright pearl that reflects the light. Then, in a good pearl or a fine pearl, you're looking for something that is pure white. Not sort of a little off-white or a little yellowy white, but pure white. And then it needs to be smooth to the touch. All of those things determine how fine, how precious a pearl will be. And in this second little story, Jesus says that a man who is looking for fine pearls finds not fine pearls, but just one. One superbly fine pearl. One pearl of great price. And the word used there is only used on one other occasion in the New Testament, and it's in John chapter 12 and verse 3. It's that moment in that week leading up to his crucifixion. The woman comes to the place where Jesus is and anoints him with an expensive perfume. Very expensive perfume. And so this one pearl is worth more than everything else that this merchant has. Now, remembering that he's a merchant, a traveller, a wholesaler, we can imagine that actually he is probably quite rich. And yet this one pearl is worth giving up all of that in order to have it and to hold it. And sometimes people will find a treasure or a pearl because they're looking for it. A little bit like David in Psalm 27. He said, "One thing I ask. This one thing is what I seek. That I may live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord." That's what he wanted. King of all Israel. Wealthy, powerful, influential. And he says, there's just one thing that I want. I want to know him. I want to gaze upon the beauty, the glory, the splendour of the Lord. Or take the story of Martin Luther. Martin Luther was a monk and tried in every possible way to find some source of peace before God. But though he tried so very, very hard, it eluded him. The story's even told that just 1 hour after going to confession, he might suddenly remember one sin that he forgot to confess. And so they'd go back in order to confess it. But he could not find a sense of peace. Not until, that is, one day when he was reading in the Scriptures and he came to that verse that simply said, "The just shall live by faith." It said that Martin Luther made a note in the margin of his Bible, "Only faith." Since at that point he thought that it had to be faith plus as many works as he could possibly do. But the harder he tried, the further peace seemed to be away from him. But now here he discovered that source of peace, his faith in God. And I believe that Jesus' two little stories here are asking of us how much we value fellowship with God. How great is the desire that is within us to know Him and to know Him better. I want to explore for a few moments just exactly what that treasure or that pearl might be. Because some would say the pearl represents salvation. So, for example, as we read in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 7, it speaks about the riches of His grace. Now, that may just mean that His grace is very rich. It's a very wonderful grace that God has shown to us. Or it may mean that that grace gives to us many riches, many treasures. Riches of forgiveness. Riches of acceptance. Riches of peace with God. That pearl of being reconciled to God. That pearl of being adopted to be a child of God. That pearl of the gift of His Spirit. The riches of His grace. And again, if we'd had time, we could have read on. We could have read most of the book of Ephesians to talk about riches and treasure. Because chapter 2 talks about the incomparable riches of His grace. That is, the blessings that come from God. There are so many of them. And that word that is translated incomparable or surpassing is simply in Greek hupabalon, which means to throw beyond. And I picture a game of cricket when a fielder on the boundary has picked up the ball and he throws it back into the wicketkeeper. Only he's thrown it back with such force that it goes right over the head of the wicketkeeper and runs out to the boundary on the other side of the field. He's thrown it way beyond where it needed to go. And the riches of God's grace go way beyond anything else that we could ever begin to imagine. Romans 5, Paul says, doesn't he, when sin abounds or increases, grace increased even more. God threw His grace over and beyond it. And in Ephesians 2, in the verses before, he talks about this overthrown grace. He says, you remember that you were dead in your sins. You were dead to the love and the grace and the goodness of God. You had no fellowship and friendship with God. But you know what? In Christ, first God made you alive. Having made you alive, He raised you up. And having raised you up, He seated you with Christ. And where is Christ? in heaven, in glory. So that's where you are seated. Yes, in the body we may be living in this world, but spiritually we are seated with Christ. Not we will be one day, but we are even now. That's that overthrow of God's grace. And it is of grace. That's why I don't think that the pearls simply represent salvation. Because salvation is a gift. We don't work for it, we don't buy it. Well, of course, Isaiah 55, God says to me, come, those of you who are thirsty, come and buy. Come buy without money and without price. And so the thought of buying is just using language, but it's made clear, buying without price. So maybe the thought here of the two men selling everything is just they're willing to give up everything in order to receive the grace of Christ. So if you want to take away the thought that the pearl is salvation, then that's probably quite fine. I could argue with you. But I wonder if we can take another step and say that the pearl may be Christ himself. So our thought is not just on the blessings that God gives to us in Christ, but the pearl is Christ himself. See, in Colossians chapter 1, Paul is saying that he has this great privilege to proclaim the gospel. Or as he says there, to proclaim the mystery of God. And that mystery, he says, is Christ in you, the hope of glory. The word mystery there is not something that we can't work out or we can't understand. What Paul says is, it was a mystery. God kept the gospel in one way secret. Okay, in the Old Testament, the sacrifices pointed towards it. The whole idea of redemption and Exodus pointed towards it. The words of the prophets spoke of Christ. But in some ways it was still hidden. But now that mystery has just been opened up to us in Jesus Christ. And Paul says the mystery of God is this. It is Christ himself. Christ in you. And for me, that takes it beyond, if I can say this carefully, simply talking about the blessings that God gives to us, to the relationship that we have with Christ himself. I want to take it another step further than that. Is it possible that the pearl here, or the treasure, is that anointing of God's Spirit that brings us into closeness, intimacy, fellowship with Christ? See, in 2 Corinthians, Paul says to the church there, we have treasure in jars of clay. I haven't buried it in the ground, but it is a clay pot in which we have great treasure. And I think it's simple enough for us to understand that the clay pot is a reference to our bodies, in all of their weakness, their frailty, and the short lifespan that we have. But if you read a couple of verses before, you'll see that the treasure that we have is actually the knowledge of the glory of God. That's the treasure that Paul is talking about. He says that God has shone into our hearts Like the sun in the early morning over the past couple of weeks that has shone into our bedroom, shone through any gap in the curtains and woken us up at 5 o'clock. But here Paul is saying, don't turn over and go back to sleep. Sit up and pay attention. Because God is shining his light into our hearts to give to us the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ. In other words, the treasure is that through Jesus Christ we may know the eternal God. Us with our clay pots can have the treasure of knowing the eternal Creator God, the Holy One, the all-wise God, God of love and grace and forgiveness. And Paul says, here is that treasure, that we may know him. That's why elsewhere Paul says, there's just one thing that I want. One thing that I want. Everything else is like rubbish. Everything else can go out for the bin. If I can have just one thing. Philippians chapter 3. I want to know Christ. I want to know the power of his resurrection. And I want to share in the fellowship of his suffering. Paul says, you can give me all the wealth in the world, but I don't want it. I want to know Christ. You can give me the highest status, but I'm not after that. I want to know Christ. That's all that he was interested in, above and beyond everything else. To know Christ. And so he goes on and he says, I haven't got there yet. One thing I do, he says, I press on in order to take hold of it. If you've been watching anything of the Olympics, you'll know what pressing on really means. Notice Paul was not a new believer here. This was not that wonderful first sense of joy and love for God when we become a disciple of Christ. Paul had been a missionary for some years. He had travelled hundreds of miles. He had planted dozens of churches. He had preached thousands of sermons. And he had suffered greatly in doing so. And it's this man, after years of being a disciple of Christ, who says, I still press on. I still want this one thing more than anything else. The pearl of Paul was an ever closer walk with God. Paul was like the two men in these two little stories here. Give up everything to have that one thing. As you read those two little parables, Jesus makes a simple statement in each story. He sold everything he had. The treasure was so fabulous. The first man must have it, whatever it costs. The man who was looking for fine pearls found one that was just so fine, he'd give up everything else for it. That's what he did. The merchant sold his land, sold his animals, laid off his servants, sold all the possessions that were inside his house and even the house itself. Crazy? Daft? Reckless? Irresponsible? Those are the kind of words that we might think. But verse 44 said, in his joy he went and sold all that he had. He was actually quite happy to see the possessions being sold. Because as he collected the cash, he could go by the field and take possession of the treasure. You know, the thing about the pearl is this. When you have treasure in the first story, you can maybe use a little of that treasure to buy some of the other things of life again. But in the second one, you can't, because it's one pearl. And that's all you're left with. It has to be a mighty fine pearl. Question is, what are we willing to give up in order to know Him? Are there sinful habits we know we need to say goodbye to? Is it the fear of being laughed at or rejected? Is it maybe some of the things of the world? Of course, we need to work, we need to earn a living, we need to be able to buy food and clothes, but that's one thing. But very easily we can become choked by the cares and the worries of this world. You've ever noticed what the writer of the Hebrews says about Moses? Hebrews 11:26. When he grew up, Moses chose. He chose something. It wasn't it just happened to come along. It wasn't there was something that he couldn't get out of. He chose. He chose to be treated badly with all the rest of the Jews. Why? Because he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as worth more than all the treasures of Egypt. Wow. That's quite an assessment of what is really important and valuable. Parable is asking us, is there anything that is too much? Is there anything that is too much in order to know Christ? You might say, I don't want to lose my friends. I don't want to lose the respect of others. I don't want people to think that I'm crazy. Maybe it's the fear of missing out on promotion, a family that may not understand, or maybe needing to live a little more modestly in this world. But is closeness with Christ worth more than anything and everything else? You know, it's not wrong for our prayer this morning maybe to be, Lord, I wish that I could say that. But when I look at my heart, if I'm really honest, I'm not really quite in that place. That's far better than just saying, yeah, of course it is. That's what I want. And God will see that honesty of our hearts and begin to draw us nearer and closer to Himself. See, Jesus said one day, this is life. To know you, the only true God. The first man found treasure and sold everything in order to have it. The second man found one pearl that was so valuable that he sold all that he had for it. The question is, what will we do? I was going to finish by saying, the pearl is there. Do you want it or not? But I thought maybe that was a bit blunt. So I'm going to finish with a comment from the Olympic Games. Many of you will know that Usain Bolt has suddenly managed to get the triple. which, to interpret for those of you who have no interest in sport at all, it means that he's won the same 3 races at the last 3 Olympic Games. The 100 metres, 200 metres, and the team relay. But what I loved was his comments when he won the 200 metres. That was goal number 8. He was satisfied, but actually he wasn't. He had got the gold medal, but I would have thought a gold medal would have been sufficient. But it wasn't. He wasn't happy with the time that he ran in that final. And I loved that. I thought that is great. Because there is somebody for whom there is a goal that is supremely important. Well, what I want to know is, if somebody can do that for 9 little pieces of gold that they'll leave behind on the day that they die, why can't that be my heart after God today? Because that's a treasure and a pearl that will never perish or fail. Let's pray together.